I got 2 videos to do today, so I'll make it quick. So, to explain, I forgot to do one on Friday. I'd make an excuse, I got one, school's a pain, but it doesn't really matter, so I'll just get 2 done anyways. So, let's take a look at the Joan experiment. For those who don't know the basics of what it was done by one Dr. Money on a child, and it was about gender and other such things. Now, normally people use it either to credit or discredit transitioning and transgender identity. Not my thing. In fact, I'll explain expressly why I don't believe the study involving this could be very good for that. But it's kind of associated with that. So, first, quick rundown. There's a boy in Canada born. He is a twin. Someone decided to do a circumcision. I forgot the word for a bit, so the circumcision actually failed, and he ended up getting a lot more than just the foreskin cut off. For all the men watching, apologies if that imagery is in your head, but that's what happened. Anyway, so the idea was to transition. See, they took him to Dr. Money, who was the person who initially separated gender and sex. Money thought that gender was purely social norms, and so, since he believed that gender was not tied to biology, one could, theoretically, in Money's own beliefs, be completely educated as one gender or the other, regardless of their initial sex, and that they would be that gender. This is the basis of the idea of non-binary genders, or specifically the idea of a gender spectrum. If gender is completely detached from birth sex, completely detached from chromosomes and any biology associated with it, then reasonably, the result is you can indoctrinate someone into the other gender so long as they are treated like that for their entire lives. So, the child was renamed, and Money studied the twins. Everyone involved was told that Joan, we'll just use these for the terms for the names, so John and Joan. So John's the male, Joan's the female version. Everyone was told that Joan was a girl. The only ones who knew, in truth, were the parents and Money. Those are the only guys who knew, other than, of course, the doctor who caused the incident. But for every intents and purpose, people knew Joan as, well, Joan, a girl. So, Money observed the twins. Furthermore, he did tests based on gender. So, things that were stereotypically female things, Joan would receive. Her brother would receive the others, for the boys. Basically, attempting to assert gender roles and norms in an effort to convince Joan that not only was Joan a girl, but as a matter of fact, Joan was entirely female. There was no John. However, here's the point on why I bring this up. Money failed. Joan was, I don't know the exact age, but teenage years or around there. But they felt off, as if they weren't a girl at all, but a boy. Now, you can see already where the transition comparisons start, but I don't recommend it. I'll explain why further later, so Money failed. Joan became John. They retransitioned back. Or should I say detransitioned, whatever you want to call it. And returned to their normal gender. the one they were born with. Now, there's a sad story. If you actually look up what happened to them, they committed suicide, I believe. It's not a pleasant thing, but here's what I'd like to highlight. So let's look over at why it can't apply to transitioning. On a surface level glance, you could see the parallels with the whole I don't feel like I'm in the right body, etc. Well, here's the issue. Joan didn't ask to transition. This isn't like transgender people who straight up ask for this. An 18-year-old who says, I don't feel like I'm a man but a woman, asks to transition and they go through a process to do so. John was not asked. He literally couldn't even speak. Thus, as a result, what ends up happening is it cannot be applied to transitioning because John never consented in the first place. Furthermore, just because of that, you automatically can rule out any argument for detransitioning because without the possibility of knowing about the transition in the first place, John reacted this way. So he clearly said, I'm not Joan, I am John, so on and so forth. As a result, we can rule out that immediately because they didn't consent to it in the first place. If they don't consent to it, reasonably you can say this is an argument for, people who actually want to do it, transitioning and then wanting to transition back. Now, you could look at detransitioners and actually make an argument, but this isn't the case here. This is purely a case of one person was forced to transition and then realized, I don't relate to this, I'm going back. And you can't make the argument for transitioning with this for the exact same reason. John did not feel like Joan ever. In fact, the entire thing, despite constant reinforcement did not solve the crisis. The dysphoria caused by feeling like one isn't in their own body was not caused by affirmation, and was not fixed by it either. No matter how much people said, you're a girl, you're a girl, you're a girl, Joan rejected that and said, no, I'm John, I am a male. Because fundamentally, that's who they saw themselves as. This cannot make any argument for or against transitioning because fundamentally, this experiment was never about transitioning. Transitioning was a means to isolate factors. Think about it like this. Let's say you wanted to experiment on a person who is, say, bald. You want to see if being bald causes a person to be treated in a certain way. So, you shave off their head and see how being bald results in their treatment, like seeing what people do now that they know that this person is bald. You cannot make an argument for shaving your head because of this, because the point of becoming bald was not because of hair or anything like that. It was to see something else. It was a means to isolate factors. So what can this experiment show? Well, what was it trying to prove? Gender can be trained. The whole point of this experiment was to see if you transition a person at an early enough age without any preconceived notions of what their gender is, without anything else, what would happen? The presumption Dr. Money made and attempted to prove was that a man can be turned into a woman if you remove all previous association with stereotypes, any of that, and replace it with the stereotypes of the new gender. Essentially, that gender is not innate to sex, but rather separate and can be trained and shifted based on societal looks. That didn't happen. Rather, what we see is that gender is tied to sex. Maybe not by much, but it's there. It doesn't matter how much John or Joan was treated like a woman or a man, they felt like a man. This is innate. There's clearly something innate about this. So you can't say, well, gender and sex are completely separate. No, that clearly they have some connection. Maybe not much, but something there. Fundamentally, there had to be something that made John go, I know I'm technically called Joan, but that doesn't feel right. Kissing a boy, like a straight woman should, did not feel right. And I know I'm not homosexual, so what's going on here? And so you start looking around and you understand, or at least John understood, actually, I'm a man. In this case, it's essentially realizing no matter how much money told me I'm this, no matter how much of this experimenting they did and observation and all these things to try to convince Joan that they are, well, John was not gone. The male was still there. There was still a connection to that biology. There was more than just social conditioning and social expression going on. This wasn't just a social construct that we were dealing with, but rather something innately tied to their biology. So you can tie gender to sex with this, because you can say, all right, let's see, you started off with one sex, transitioned to the other in terms of gender, so socially and in relation to society, but that never changed the initial one. The sex stayed the same, at least in terms of how they were thinking, because the internals was all still John. It was on the outside they changed, and there was no confusion beforehand by John about wanting to be Joan. So, as a result, if the internals are untouched, but the outside has changed, and the outside is basically pushed to the side because the internals show, that clearly indicates there's something inherent about this. Sex is somewhat inherent. Now, I won't argue on how much it is, but it's clearly there. Also, I believe the last name was like Kramer or something. Kramer, Rayner. I'm not good at names. Now, the experiment has come under a lot of heat for a number of reasons. Notably the way Dr. Money treated the twins, but you can look that up yourself, not my problem. However, based on what I have observed with this experiment, or you can't make an argument against transitioning using it, because again, there is no consent in the first place. You can't consent to this the same. It does show there's some level of tie with gender and sex. So the idea of gender is not sex is partially wrong, at least. There's clearly something tying them together. So you can't just say they're two separate spectrums or anything like that. There's something connecting these two. And thus, would I argue that non-binary is not a thing that exists? Yes, 100% based on this. Because there's some tie, however strong, to sex from gender. These two are connected. As a result, you cannot remove them from each other, fundamentally, if we're going by this experiment and this test. Anyways, that'll be all. I'll make a second video, and we'll see how that goes.